Snow fell quietly in the town of Dead Mare's Crossing, blanketing the muddy streets and wooden roofs with a deceptive peace. The cold didn't stop the crowd that gathered for the annual winter livestock auction, a grim ritual as dependable as death, taxes, and the law failing to show up on time. Men wrapped in thick coats and stiff leathers muttered through chapped lips, breath fogging in the freezing air. Horses agitated by the cold and the noise snorted in their pens and stamped frozen earth with steel-shod hooves. Among the crowd stood Rhett Callahan, tall and unmoving, wrapped in a long oilskin duster and the kind of silence that made people nervous. His eyes gray like a thundercloud, holding back lightning, scanned the pens without much interest. He'd come for a workhorse, nothing more, something strong, something quiet, much like himself. Then he saw her. She wasn't pinned or tied. She stood next to a chestnut mare, one hand resting lightly on the animal's neck like they shared the same pulse. Her skin was windburnt, her white dress soaked and clinging to her legs. A single braid, thick and black, hung down to her waist, heavy with snowflakes. She wasn't shivering. She just stood there, calm and still, like the eye of a storm. Rhett's boots crunched in the snow as he stepped closer. The crowd around her parted, whispering, "Not about the girl. About him. Callahan's lookin', means trouble. He don't talk unless he means to kill or buy. Heard he shot a man in Kansas for touchin' his hat." The auctioneer, a round man in a fur coat and too many rings, waved a gloved hand lazily over the chestnut mare. "Fine animal, 5 years old, sound legs, good lungs, comes with the girl." A few chuckles, a few sidelong glances. Some men elbowed each other. Rhett's jaw clenched. He stepped up, silent, eyes fixed on the girl. "She ain't for sale," he said flatly. The auctioneer gave a shrug that said more than words ever could. "Part of the package, Mr. Callahan, seller insists, claims, well, Indian debt. Found her running off last month, says he's owed. Won't fetch $1 on her own." Rhett didn't reply, and that's when she looked up. Her eyes locked onto his, not soft, not pleading, but burning, like she saw something inside him no one else dared look for. "Don't buy the horse," she said. The crowd stilled. Even the chestnut mare stopped shifting. Her voice wasn't broken or weak, it was sure, sharp, like an arrow loosed from a bowstring. "Buy me, rancher," she said. "I'll be yours forever." A ripple moved through the crowd. Laughter died. Boots scraped in the snow. Rhett didn't blink, didn't move, but something in him shifted just slightly. She wasn't begging, she was offering. No shackles, no tears, just a challenge. He looked at the mare, then back at her. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a thick fold of banknotes, heavy and weathered. He tossed them onto the auctioneer's table without a word. The auctioneer gaped. "That'll do," Rhett said, "for the package." And then he walked over, placed a hand gently on the girl's shoulder, and said only one word, "Come." She didn't hesitate, didn't look back. The crowd made way for them as they disappeared into the snow, leaving behind whispers, footprints, and a story no one would ever stop telling. The snow had thickened by the time they reached the edge of town. The wind howled low, like it had a secret to keep, and Rhett Callahan rode in silence. The girl nigh behind him on the chestnut mare. She didn't speak, didn't tremble. She simply held on, her thin arms wrapped around his coat, her cheek pressed lightly against his back. Dead Mare's Crossing faded behind them, swallowed by snow and shadow. The Callahan Ranch sat at the end of a narrow ridge trail that snaked between ice-hardened pine and jagged cliffside. 2 barns, 1 cabin, and a corral that was all Rhett had left of what once was a proud spread. Years of loss had stripped him down to bare essentials. When they arrived, he dismounted first, handed her the reins without a word, and walked toward the barn. Naya followed, silent as a ghost, until he turned and finally spoke. "You cold?" She paused. "Yes." He nodded, toward the cabin. "Go inside. Stove's lit, water in the pot, food on the shelf." She didn't thank him, just nodded, once, and stepped inside. Rhett unsaddled the mare, brushed her down, and stood with her for a while, hands resting on her neck. Snow fell steady now, turning the earth into ash. He wasn't sure what he'd just brought into his home, a debt, a burden, a mistake, or something else entirely. Inside the cabin, warmth crept up the walls like an old friend returning. The stove popped and hissed, the smell of burnt coffee and pine resin filling the room. Naya sat cross-legged by the fire, holding a cup of water close to her chest. Her dress hung from her like a rag on a nail, wet and clinging. Rhett tossed her a blanket. "There's clothes in the chest. Belonged to my sister." She glanced at him. "Where is she now?" "Dead." Naya didn't flinch, just nodded. "Thank you." Rhett pulled off his coat, hung it by the door, and sat across from her at the table, arms folded, gaze steady. "You said I could buy you." She met his stare. "I said I'd be yours." He leaned forward. "You running from something?" "Yes." "Was that auction a trick? Some kind of game?" "No." Trick. Her voice was quiet, firm. "You saw the man who sold me. You think he lets go of what's his for fun?" Rhett's eyes narrowed. "So what's the play? Do you think I'm better?" "No." She looked directly at him. I think you're different.
You didn't.
Liked that answer, mostly because it felt true. He didn't want to be anyone's better. He just wanted quiet, solitude, a horse. Not a girl with sharp eyes and scars in her voice. But she was here now, and something about her didn't sit easy. Not in a dangerous way, just not in a way he could ignore. He rose and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered land. You can stay here for the season, he said. You work, you eat, you leave when the thaw comes. Naya didn't reply right away. Then she said, I won't leave, not unless you send me. Rhett didn't turn around. We'll see. She stood and moved toward the chest to change. As she passed him, she said softly, You didn't buy me rancher, you rescued me. That makes us even more dangerous. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, two strangers sat across from each other, not enemies, not yet allies, but bound by something unspoken, and in the distance, on the ridge trail behind them, hoofbeats echoed faintly through the trees. The past wasn't done chasing her. And now, it was coming for them both. The storm passed by morning, leaving the world glazed in white and silence. Rhett Callahan rose before the sun, same as he always did, lit the stove, and stepped outside to tend the horses. He didn't say a word when he passed Naya sleeping on the small cot near the fire, bundled in his sister's old quilt. He wasn't sure if she was really asleep. Her breathing was too even, too still. Out in the barn, he fed the stock, checked the traps, and salted the path to the well. The rhythm of work helped him forget for a moment that he wasn't alone anymore, but she didn't forget. Naya was awake before the rooster's call. She folded her blanket neatly, washed in the basin, and met him in the barn, just as the last stall door swung open. Rhett glanced up, surprised. You're early, she shrugged. You said I work, I eat. He handed her a brush. Start with the mare. They didn't talk much that morning, but they didn't need to. By midday, Rhett found himself watching her from the corner of his eye. The way she moved, calm, methodical, sure-footed in the snow-covered dirt, wasn't the way someone raised in captivity moved. She handled horses like she'd been raised around them, spoke to them in low tones, in a language he didn't recognize, and they listened. He didn't ask questions, not yet, but that night, by the fire, as snow tapped gently on the roof and wind whispered across the chimney, Naya spoke first. You're not like them. Rhett didn't look up from his stew. Them who? She stirred her own bowl absently. Men who buy, men who take, men who pretend kindness just to own you differently. He paused. You think I'm kind. I think you're alone. He smirked a little at that. And what about you? I haven't belonged anywhere since I was 10. Bob pulled his eyes to her. He set the spoon down. You want to talk about it? She shook her head. Not want, but you should hear it. So he listened. Naya was born to the Lakota. In the Black Hills, her tribe was small, proud, and hidden deep from the reach of settlers. But when disease swept through, they had no medicine, no help. So her father traded. He brought her to a white trader named Emery. Brody offered her for care and promised she'd be returned when the sickness passed. She never saw her family again. Brody kept her. Not as a daughter, not even as a servant. She was a debt, he'd say, something he could use to seal deals, impress guests, or threaten when coin ran low. Over time, she learned to survive. Not with strength, but with silence. She watched, she listened, and she waited. When men lied, she remembered. When women wept, she hid. And when she saw Rhett Callahan ride into town the first time months ago, during a cattle drive, she didn't see a man like Brody. She saw a man who rode alone, bought no whiskey, spoke to no whores, and left without a trail of mess behind him. He didn't look at people, she told Rhett. You just looked at the ground, or the sky. Like both were more trustworthy. Rhett rubbed the bridge of his nose. I came to town for nails. I left because I saw what that place was becoming. Naya looked at him. Then maybe you knew I was there. Rhett leaned back in his chair. Maybe. A long silence stretched. Between them, the fire popped. The wind howled once and then fell quiet again. Then Rhett said, You're not a debt here. You understand that? She nodded slowly. I don't need you to repay anything. Still, she didn't speak. Finally, she said, But I need to become something. Otherwise, what was all that pain for? He looked across the fire at her. Eyes narrowed slightly. You will, he said, but don't rush it. Winter has a way of forcing things before they're ready. Outside, the storm clouds began to part, but the horizon wasn't clear, and somewhere, not far off, a group of riders was heading west led by a man with a crooked smile and a rusted rifle. Emery Brody wasn't finished with her. The sky turned red before dawn, not the kind of red that meant sunrise was coming, the kind that meant something was burning. Rhett Callahan stood on the porch, steaming, coffee in one hand, rifle in the other, eyes locked on the distant hills to the east. The fire was miles off, but rising fast black smoke, twisting into the sky like a snake uncoiling. Inside, Naya was already awake. She moved like someone who had slept lightly, if at all. She saw the smoke through the window and didn't ask. What it was, she already knew. Rhett didn't turn when he heard her behind him. That ridge fire. Not natural. No, her voice was steady. They're marking their path. making sure I know. You sure it's them? I'm sure it's him. Rhett didn't ask which him. He could guess. Emery Brody was the kind of man who'd light a forest to find a single deer, and the more Nia talked about him, the more Rhett's jaw clenched. He wasn't a man who made enemies lightly, but once they were made, he didn't forget. Nia stepped beside him, blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. He won't come alone. Rhett nodded. I know. By midday, the smoke had spread into the valley. A thin layer of ash began to fall like dirty snow. Rhett saddled the horses, set out water, and loaded every rifle he owned for total. 1 for the barn, 1 for the cabin. 2, on him. Nia helped without needing direction. She gathered kindling, packed food, loaded shells into a weathered belt that had once belonged to Rhett's father. You shoot? He asked, watching her. Only when I mean to kill. That answer told him more than he expected. She wasn't a girl anymore. Maybe she never had been. At sunset, the sound of hooves reached the ridge slow and measured, like a funeral march. Rhett stepped onto the porch, rifle slung casually across his chest. Nia stood inside the doorway, just behind the frame. Her silhouette didn't move. Then they came into view. 3 riders, leading them a tall man in a long brown coat, gray around the temples, crooked grin beneath a scraggly beard. Emery Brody. He reined his horse to a stop about 30 feet from the porch. Looked Rhett up and down like inspecting livestock. Well, Callahan. Didn't think you'd be the type to take in stray girls. Rhett didn't flinch. Didn't think you'd be the type to sell people like cattle. Brody chuckled. Everything's for sale in this world, even dignity. You lookin' to buy yours back? Then, the grin dropped off Brody's face. Behind him, the other 2 riders, his brothers, by the look of them, shifted in their saddles. One rested his hand on a shotgun. The other spat in the snow. Brody leaned forward in the saddle, voice lowering. That girl, she ain't yours. She's part of a trade. A deal signed in blood. She's not property. She's not free either. Rhett cocked the hammer on his rifle with one hand, slow and deliberate. She is now. Brody's eyes narrowed. You're not ready for the war you just bought into, Callahan. I've been at war since before you could spell your own damn name. A tense silence followed, the kind that freezes breath and tightens trigger fingers. Then Brody laughed short and sharp. Fine, you made your bed. Rancher, she better be worth dying for. He turned his horse. We'll be back, and next time, we won't knock. The 3 riders turned and disappeared back into the haze, smoke curling behind them like devils. Breath. Back inside. Rhett began locking the cabin doors, reinforcing the windows. Nia followed him silently. You think he'll come back tonight? She asked. No, Rhett said. He'll wait for the weather to turn. Maybe for backup. He wants a show. Nia looked out into the falling ash. Then we give him one. Rhett paused. You don't have to stay in this fight. You could run now. I wouldn't stop you. She turned to him, eyes fierce. I ran my whole life. That ends here. Outside, the wind picked up. The last rays of light died in smoke and soot. Somewhere out in those dark hills, Brody's fire still burned. And inside the cabin, 2 people who'd spent their lives alone were ready to fight for something more than survival. They came at dawn. The sky was a muted gray, a heavy quilt of clouds pressing down on the frozen earth. Snow drifted softly, slow and deliberate, tumbling like pale feathers through the cold air. The world was hushed, wrapped in a quiet so deep, it almost seemed sacred until it wasn't. The silence shattered with the sharp crack of gunfire. Rhett had been waiting. He knew these woods, these fields, and this land as if it had been sewn directly into the fabric of his own flesh. Every tree, every dip in the ground, every hidden root was a part of him. He moved like a shadow, a ghost in the snow, each step measured and sure. The traps he'd laid the night before were dead simple, but deadly effective. They were waiting, just like he was. The first brother, Clay, came around the corner near the barn. He was cautious, but not cautious enough. A snap of steel, a muffled cry, and Clay went down, his leg caught in one of Rhett's wire snares. He struggled, the panic in his eyes as the cold bit deep, but before he could free himself, Rhett's rifle barked from the shadows, and Clay collapsed onto the frozen ground, blood darkening the white snow beneath him. Wade, the second brother, was less fortunate but more stubborn. He charged through the yard, firing blindly into the dawn. A bullet caught him square in the gut, and he staggered back, clutching at his belly, face twisted in pain and rage. He collapsed near the split-rail fence, coughing blood, his breath ragged and harsh in the cold air. Rhett didn't hesitate. He moved forward with a silent, deadly purpose. Inside the house, Jed, the youngest and quickest of the brothers, had managed to slip past the traps and the gunfire. His footsteps were frantic, pounding across the creaking wooden floor. But Nia was waiting. She was a force of nature, fierce and unyielding. When Jed came through the doorway, she swung a heavy fire iron with practiced precision. The blow caught him in the throat, cutting off his air. His momentum, Jed's eyes widened in shock as he grasped at his neck. Stumbling backward, choking, his strength draining away. Rhett was already there. His hands were steady, his face calm but resolute. He had no mercy left for them, not for the threats they posed, not for the blood they'd spilled on his land. With a final, quiet motion, Rhett ended it. The dawn returned to silence. Snow continued to fall in gentle spirals, covering the evidence, muffling the harshness of the morning's violence. The world seemed to hold its breath once more, but the land was no longer the same. It bore the weight of what had happened, just as Rhett bore the scars of the fight in his heart. Naya stood beside him, watching the sky lighten. Her hands still gripped the fire iron tightly, but her eyes were distant, lost in the cold promise of the new day. Together, they faced the quiet aftermath to souls bound by survival and the fierce determination to protect what was theirs. They had come for blood, but Rhett and Naya had drawn the line, and no one crossed it. After the blood dried, the world seemed to shift in an uneasy stillness. The once crackling fire, now reduced to smoldering embers, cast long shadows that flickered against the rough-hewn walls of the cabin. Outside, the snowfall had softened to a gentle whisper, the pale flakes settling like a fragile veil over the ground stained dark by violence. Inside, the silence was heavy, thick with the weight of what had been done. Naya sat alone by the fire, her hands clasped tightly around a tin cup that had long since gone cold. The firelight danced across her face, illuminating the trace of dirt and ash, the tired lines carved by months, no years of hardship. She had been strong, ferocious even, in the fight, but now, in the quiet aftermath, something broke free from within her, a fragile, trembling sorrow she hadn't allowed herself until this moment. She wept, not for the brothers who had come to take what wasn't theirs, not for the blood they had spilled, nor for the vengeance she and Rhett had dealt. No, her tears were not for them, they were for herself, for the woman she had become, the hardened survivor forged in fire and fear, for the choices she had made, the lines she'd crossed, for the steel she'd wrapped around her heart to survive a world that demanded she'd be less than whole. Her tears slid down her cheeks silently, tracing cold paths over her skin, hot with shame and grief. She whispered into the night, her voice barely audible above the soft crackle of dying flames. "You didn't buy me," she said, her words raw and trembling. "You freed me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. She wasn't property to be sold, bartered, or claimed. She was no one's possession, and retreat had given her something neither of them had dared to hope for. Freedom. Freedom not just from chains, but from the past, from fear, from the endless fight to survive. Rhett said nothing. He sat a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the shadows dancing in the firelight. His face was calm, unreadable, the quiet strength of a man who bore many scars beneath his stoic exterior. His silence wasn't coldness, it was respect. Respect for the weight of her words. The battle behind them, Naya's breath hitched. The ache inside her heart twisted and turned, but amidst the turmoil, a fragile hope bloomed. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out her hand. Her fingers trembled as they brushed against his, uncertain if the touch would be met with rejection or acceptance, but Rhett didn't pull away. His hand closed gently over hers, rough and warm, a silent promise that she was not alone, that in this bleak, unforgiving world, they could be something more than just survivors, something stronger. The fire flickered, sending golden light across their joined hands, a quiet testament to the fragile connection forged in the crucible of violence and pain. In that small, tender moment, the cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a home. Naya swallowed hard, her tears finally slowing, replaced by a steady breath she hadn't known she needed. The weight of the night began to lift, even if just a little, as she allowed herself to lean into the unexpected comfort of Rhett's presence. They had both changed, shaped and hardened by what they had endured. But here, now, there was a beginning, not of forgetting, but of healing, not of surrender, but of choice. Together, they would face whatever came next, not as captor and captive, not as enemies or victims, but as something more, partners bound, not by chains, but by trust. Outside, the snow continued to fall in gentle spirals, silent and steady, washing the world clean beneath the pale light of dawn. And inside, a fragile peace settled between them, fragile as a single flame, but burning, bright enough to hold back the dark. Spring came slow that year. The snow melted reluctantly, inch by icy inch, revealing the stubborn earth beneath, still hard and cold from the long, merciless winter. The days grew longer, the sun climbing higher, its light hesitant but insistent. Buds peeked from bare branches, tentative green against the lingering grays of frost and sky. Life was waking again, but it was slow, cautious, like a breath held too long. Naya watched it all from the porch of the ranch house. Wrapped in a worn shawl, her hands busy with the steady rhythm of chores, she moved through the mornings with a quiet grace that hadn't been there before. She wasn't fragile, no, she had been forged, tempered in fire, hardened by loss and survival, and now, rooted deep in this land that stretched out like an unspoken promise. Ranch life was demanding, but Naja learned quickly, the weight of the world hadn't broken her, it had built something stronger. She learned to saddle the horses with steady hands, to mend fences with rough-hewn skill, to coax life from the soil like it was a secret language only the patient could understand. She moved through the days with a purpose, the kind that comes not from obligation but from a choice of fierce, unyielding will to live on her own terms. And the town began to notice. Whispers floated like dust in the afternoon sun, soft but persistent. But this time, they were different. No longer were the words about how Rhett had bought her like some possession, some prize. The story had changed, reshaped by the truth that was impossible to ignore. They whispered about how Naya had chosen to stay, how she had carved a place for herself beside Rhett, not behind him, not under him, but standing as an equal. Not a broken woman stitched back together by someone else's hands, but a partner, a force to be reckoned with. They saw her riding beside him now, the wind catching her dark hair as she urged her horse forward across the rolling hills and sun-dapped fields. She was no longer the shadow that followed. She was a presence in her own right, steady, fierce, and free. The townsfolk watched the way she carried herself, the way her eyes held a spark no one could extinguish. Some admired it in secret, others respected it reluctantly, but all understood that something had shifted irreversibly. Naya had become more than the sum of her scars. One afternoon, as the golden light stretched long across the pasture, Rhett and Naya rode out together. The horses moved in perfect rhythm, muscles rippling under glossy coats, hooves beating a steady rhythm on the earth. The air smelled of fresh grass and warm soil, alive with the promise of new beginnings. They rode side by side, a quiet statement, made in silence. Rhett glanced at her, catching the way the sun caught the edges of her face, illuminating the fierce calm in her eyes. There was no need for words. This was their truth. No chains, no debts, just two souls who had fought their way back from darkness to something real. Naya's lips curved in a small, knowing smile. This was more than survival. This was life. And as the days warmed and the fields bloomed with the first flowers of spring, something else blossomed too, a new kind of winter, tempered by the fire of renewal. The harsh cold of what had been was fading, replaced by the steady heat of what could be. She had come through the storm, not as a victim, not as a possession, but as a woman who chose her own path. And every whisper in town, every glance, every uncertain word was a testament to that quiet revolution. Because sometimes the hardest winters bring the strongest springs. And this one, this new kind of winter, was just the beginning. Asterisk on a clear spring night. The kind where the sky stretched wide and deep above the world like a vast, shimmering canvas. Rhett and Naya stood side by side. The air was crisp and sweet, carrying the scent of blooming wildflowers and fresh earth. Above them, stars glittered like scattered diamonds, each one silent witness to a story that had been written in blood, fire, and stubborn hope. The chestnut horse that had first brought them together shifted its weight quietly nearby, its breath a soft mist in the cool night air. The same horse, the same land, but everything else had changed. Rhett's hand brushed lightly against Naya's, rough and calloused but steady. His voice broke the silence, low and honest, carrying a weight that made her heart skip. "I want you to stay," he said, "not because you owe me, not as some debt or burden, but because I want you to stay, as my equal." For a moment, Naya stared at him, disbelief and something softer spark of something she hadn't allowed herself before shining in her eyes. Then, laughter bubbled up from deep inside her. It was light and genuine, the sound of a woman who had fought long not to claim what was hers. "I already did," she said, her voice steady, fierce with quiet certainty. Rhett smiled then, a slow, honest curve of lips that spoke of hard-won peace and the promise of something new. From his pocket, he pulled a small, worn box. Inside lay a ring, handmade, simple, and honest. It wasn't flashy or grand, but it was perfect. A circle of silver, smoothed by years of patient labor. Shining softly in the starlight, he slipped the ring onto her finger, the gesture carrying a weight deeper than words could hold. It was a promise, not of ownership, but of partnership. A symbol of a bond forged in fire and choice, not in chains or circumstance. Naya looked down at the ring, then back into Rhett's steady gaze. There was no hesitation there, no question of what this meant. It meant freedom and trust. It meant belonging not to someone else, but to each other. They stood there, the night wrapping around them like a quiet embrace. Behind them, the town watched. But this time, the looks were different. The whispered judgments that once followed, Naya-like shadows, had faded into silence. No one looked away with pity or scorn. No one whispered about a girl bought or sold, because she wasn't a girl for sale. Anymore, she was a woman who had made her own choice, and she had chosen forever. Together, they mounted the chestnut horse, side by side, moving forward in unison. The steady rhythm of hooves echoed softly through the cool night, a steady beat against the quiet world. The path ahead was uncertain, full of challenges and hard days, but it was theirs to walk. Together, Naya felt the warmth of Rhett's hand on her thigh, grounding her, reminding her that this was real, that she was no longer bound by fear or survival alone. She was bound by something stronger, a love that had been earned, not given. The stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, as if blessing the moment. As they rode through the quiet town, the streets bathed in silver moonlight, Naya's heart swelled with a fierce joy. This was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, written by her own hand, shared with a man who saw her not as a prize, but as an equal. Past houses where windows glowed softly, where neighbors watched in respectful silence. There was no need for words. The sight of them riding side by side said everything. No chains, no debts, only choice, only love. And beneath that endless sky, with the cool spring breeze carrying the scent of renewal, Naya whispered to herself, a quiet vow against the night. I chose this. And that choice was hers alone, free, fierce, and forever.